Deputy Paul Murphy.
Thanks, Ciarán. The whole debate about Europe in this state and in Britain is founded on a big lie. That's a propaganda technique that involves a lie so big that nobody could believe that it's a lie. The central lie is that the European Union is a bringer of economic and social progress. It's the lie that the European Union is democratic. It's the lie that the European Union is founded on the basis of human rights. And when we debate Europe, that big lie is combined with Project Fear. Alistair Campbell today is trying to recruit Irish people into joining in Project Fear, to spread the message of Project Fear. I think the government would like TDs to join in the message of Project Fear. Well, I, for one, am not going to participate in Project Fear. I'm not going to participate in what is the favoured weapon of the European establishment, used here whenever we have had referenda, and two referenda on particular issues, used to incredible extent in Greece, and now being used in Britain and in the north, where it has an added sectarian edge. We don't accept the central line of Project Fear that if you do not go along with the neoliberal orthodoxy and the undemocratic nature of the European Union, that disaster will unfold. That the reality of what the European Union is was shielded for a long time behind rhetoric and behind propaganda. However, while it might not be clear to many people here, that facade has been crumbling and the reality has been gradually being laid brutally bare over the course of the crisis because of the actions of the EU institutions. And it is now rightly clear to whole numbers of people that the Europe we have is not one of democracy, is not one of human rights, but one of institutionalised austerity, one of attacks on workers' rights, and one of war and racism. Look at the issue of the rights of refugees. The big lie is that the EU welcomes refugees and defends their rights. Not for us, the policies of Donald Trump. But the reality is that the policies of Fortress Europe are directly responsible for turning the Mediterranean into a graveyard of refugees. A new report came out 2 days ago, Death by Rescue, which confirms what I argued here about 6 months ago, that in withdrawing Operation Triton and replacing it with Mare Nostrum, that the European authorities knew that more refugees would die, and they did it to try to discourage people from coming. A 2014 Frontex internal assessment stated, it has to be stressed that the withdrawal of naval assets from the area, if not properly planned and announced well in advance, would likely result in a higher number of fatalities. What was predicted is what happened, which means that Charles Heller, a co-author of the report, is correct when he said that European policymakers and Frontex have made themselves guilty of killing by omission. The same approach is evidence in the rotten deal with Turkey for mass expulsion of asylum seekers to a country with a record of human rights abuses and persecution, turning Turkey into an open prison camp for those trying to escape the horrors of the Middle East and enter Europe. As for the idea that we have social progress and a social Europe and that it's a force for workers' rights, the idea can only be maintained by closing your eyes to what happened, what was done by the Troika over the course of the crisis. In this country, the European Central Bank and the European Commission pressurised, and the then Fianna Fáil Green government agreed to, the biggest bank bailout in the world, for which we're still paying the price. They imposed, and governments agreed to, an immense programme of austerity that has resulted in deep crises in our public services, deep inequality and a low-wage economy. Why? They did it to save the big European banks, to ensure the bondholders got their money back. Because that's who the European Union works for. It's a club for the bankers, for the bondholders, for big business. They did the same with Greece, to even more horrifying consequences with Spain and with Portugal. The result is a humanitarian catastrophe in Greece, wages cut by a third, public services cut by a quarter, widespread poverty, every single index of deprivation completely off the charts. And it hasn't worked to resolve the crisis, but has worked for who it was meant to work, which is the 1% in Europe. Social Europe was always a myth. It's just been revealed now over the past number of years. Those elements, like equal pay for equal work in EU law, were not granted by the European Commission or the European Council from above. They were won by struggles from below, in that case by the struggles and strikes of French women workers in the Bread and Roses strikes in 1946, which was then enshrined and reflected in the Treaty of Rome in 1957, but wasn't implemented since further waves of strike movements and mobilisations in the 60s and 70s. With the interpretation of the Posted Workers Directive in cases like Vaxholm and Laval, you see the reality of how this works to facilitate a race to the bottom in terms of workers' wages and conditions. But the policy of the dictation of austerity, it's not a temporary aberration for the crisis. It is a permanent policy, and it's written into law, firstly to a significant degree by the Maastricht Treaty, and the Fiscal Treaty, the Six-Pack, the Two-Pack. They're the reasons that we had this ridiculous debate during the elections about fiscal space. That's the almost non-existent space within the right-wing, neoliberal, Thatcherite EU rules, which say the policies that we can implement that stay within those rules. So with optimistic growth projections, they were able to say perhaps there was up to 10 billion to put back into public services when 40 billion was taken out in the course of the crisis. But if the growth turns into a negative, well then those same fiscal rules mean the fiscal space becomes a negative. That actually more austerity is demanded by those rules, as we pointed out at the time of the Fiscal Treaty, and so you have a crisis and then more austerity imposed, driving a downward spiral. The lie that the European Union is democratic or a force for democracy deserves to be utterly ridiculed. It does not stand up. We've had at least 3 silent coups driven by the unelected European Central Bank over the past 6 years. The Italian and Greek governments were removed in 2011, both replaced with governments by bankers, for bankers, operating in the interests of bankers. Then the coup last year in Greece, with which unfortunately Tsipras was complicit, directed against the Syriza programme, directed against the 61% rejection of austerity measures. The European Central Bank, responsible for the banking system in Europe, deliberately brought the Greek banking system to the point of collapse, with the Irish government screaming, pull the trigger at them to try to force people to accept austerity. And those policies, right-wing policies, don't just apply internally in the EU, they apply to the external policy of the EU. You look at the trade deals that the EU does around the world. They're designed to exploit the natural resources and workers of the global south. It's currently negotiating TTIP, the biggest free trade deal in the world, a charter for corporate rights, driving a race to the bottom of the Atlantic in terms of workers' consumer and environmental rights, and it would grant corporations the right to sue states if they do anything that interferes with their right to profit. Also, the notion that the European Union is in some sense a project for peace, it doesn't relate to the reality of the facts that we have. You have the establishment of battle groups, which means that the European Union can field 50,000 troops anywhere in the world within 5 days. Or you go and read the Lisbon Treaty, where Article 42.3 sets out very clearly the Member States shall undertake progressively to improve their military capabilities. The EU has war and imperialism at its heart rather than peace. But the resources do exist within Europe. Massive resources exist to have a decent life for everybody, decent wages and conditions for everybody, good quality public services for everybody, for the right of asylum to be protected for everybody have the right to a decent home. The problem is that those resources are hoarded by a small, super-rich minority, super-rich corporations in particular, who collectively hoard €3 trillion in the EU. The point is that that wealth needs to be nationalised. It needs to be taken into democratic public ownership, the major financial institutions, the banks, the big corporations, and used in a democratically planned way to meet the needs and aspirations of people. In other words, a socialist Europe. A socialist Europe will be built democratically from the bottom up, without the dictatorial powers of the European Commission or the European Central Bank. That's the vision of a democratic and socialist Europe that we and socialists across Europe are fighting for. Obviously, when people go to the polls for this referendum in Britain and in the North, there will be no option of voting for such a socialist Europe. The choice is for or against this Europe of austerity, of war, of racism, and therefore socialists in Britain and in the North, including the Socialist Party, are campaigning against this right-wing Europe as a way of removing barriers to socialist change. They have zero in common with the right-wing Tories and UKIPers who unfortunately have been allowed to dominate the Leave campaign. Their vision of a more neoliberal, more anti-immigrant, more anti-worker Britain out of the European Union is an anathema to socialists. But instead, socialists see this as an opportunity to take out 2 barriers to socialist change: Tories on one side and the European Union and their restrictive rules on the other. We're for a vote against this European Union on a socialist and on an internationalist basis. Not a vote for isolation, but a vote for building a different Europe, a democratic and socialist Europe that works for the millions instead of the millionaires. A vote against the European Union is a real possibility. If it happens, it will cause a deep crisis for Cameron, and for the Tories. It could well precipitate a general election, which could lead to a Corbyn-led Labour Party coming to power. If that government was to implement socialist policies in Britain, it would transform the debate that we have about what kind of society we have, about how our wealth is used, how our wealth is owned, and what kind of Europe that we need. It will be a big step forward to building that kind of socialist Europe that we need. Just a point about the debate in this country. The indications are that in the event of Brexit, that IBEC would use it to try to attack and undermine wages and conditions, saying that even the 50-cent increase in the minimum wage, which was paltry, was a mistake, and that in the event of Brexit and sterling devaluation, the minimum wage could be 40% higher here than in Britain. That's an indication that they would go on an offensive against the minimum wage and against wages generally. A strong signal should go out against that Project Fear, that IBEC should back off. Brexit would not be accepted a reason to attack wages and conditions, that we reject that whole notion of Project Fear, and that we join in that struggle for a Europe not of the 1%, not of the bankers, bondholders and big business, but a socialist Europe of the 99% of the millions right across Europe.
Thank you very much.